Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Today we will start discussion on the second part of our course, that is on macroeconomics. We've completed our discussion on microeconomics and I very much hope you enjoyed it. Today we'll begin discussion of the four major elements within macroeconomics, that is unemployment, inflation, growth, and balance of payments and exchange rate problems. We'll deal with these problems in order. But before we deal with them, it's very important that you develop a feel, a broad understanding of what macroeconomics is about, how macroeconomic thinking has evolved, and what are the major macroeconomic issues and theories floating around us today. Now, there are two or three things that I want to clarify at the very start of our discussion, that is at this starting stage of introduction to macroeconomics. The first thing is that unlike other sciences, unlike physics, chemistry, biology, economics is a social science and as such dependent on the events that happen around us or that the events that happen in society. So, knowing that, macroeconomics in particular, which deals with the events in the overall economy, has been greatly influenced by economic events during the last century or the last century and a half. So it's not possible to fully understand economics, especially macroeconomics, without getting some idea of the history of economic events in the last 100 or 150 years. It's possible to go through a physics and chemistry textbook and read the entire textbook, read all the theories, without having an idea of what was actually happening with the universe or with atoms in particular during this last 200 periods or 300 years period. But it's not possible to do that with economics. If you want a good grasp, a good handle on the concepts that are used in macroeconomics, then you need to see how they relate to the specific economic events that were happening during this time and how those concepts were a product of some of those events. I'm not saying that macroeconomic theory or theoretical developments have not impacted macroeconomic policy and then through that have not reflected or manifested in economic events. No, there has been a causation from theory towards events as well. But the reverse causation, that is macroeconomic events or major economic happenings causing economists to think about those events and then articulate their theories in the context of those events, this direction of causality has been very strong in macroeconomics. The other thing that I want to clarify, and this is an extension of this point, is that you should not expect me to teach you macroeconomics only in the context of how it applies in Pakistan, or that is in the context of the Pakistani economy. Certainly, there are many interesting things about Pakistan's macroeconomics, about inflation, the state of poverty, our foreign trade, investment sector, balance of payments, exchange rates, the monetary side, the banking system. There are a number of interesting issues there. But in order to give you a good grounding in macroeconomics, as it should be given to you at an introductory level, it's important that I teach you economics, or at least macroeconomics, in the order, in the sequence that it evolved. As I told you, that macroeconomic theory in particular has developed according to particular events that happened in the last 100 years. Now, we need to see where those events happened. If those events had happened in India or Pakistan or the South Asian region in general, then maybe it would have been easier to explain macroeconomics in the context of these economies. But if you look back, you will find that most of the events that triggered major macroeconomic theoretical breakthroughs or ways of thinking happened in either North America or Western Europe, or the Soviet Union. More recently, there were events in East Asia, where we said that there was the East Asian miracle that's happened since the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Similarly, there's been the third world debt problem, and that has caused some research to happen. But the original events which prompted the initial thinking on macroeconomics were all associated with developments in the now advanced economies. And so it is important for us to go back to that time, understand that scenario, and see how macroeconomic thinking evolved in that context. Don't get disheartened though. This does not mean that I will not be talking about the Pakistani economy or the economic issues of the third world or the less developed or lower income countries. We will talk about that. We will have a separate module, a separate section on that, and probably the last 2 or 3 lectures in macroeconomics will be devoted to developing an understanding of the economic issues, the macroeconomic issues and microeconomic issues faced by the lower income countries, including countries or emerging markets like Pakistan. That said, let me also clarify one more point. That is, macroeconomics does not have a unique way in which it can be taught. There are a number of ways in which you can teach macroeconomics. There are a number of variables. They are all related to each other in very complex ways. And so it is possible for certain teachers to highlight certain links or certain interactions, certain relationships between certain variables. And therefore it is quite possible that when you pick up one textbook, you will find the same thing being explained in different terms than the way it is explained in another textbook. So I don't want to be charged with this allegation that you've only taught us economics or macroeconomics in a certain way. This is a problem that you will confront wherever you go. Some people think of macroeconomic thinking and the way it has evolved only in the context of development in the labor market. That is the old debate about whether wages are sticky, that is inflexible, or wages are flexible. Some people focus on prices in general, whether prices were sticky or flexible. Other people talk about expectations, that whether agents are rational expectations agents or whether they have adaptive or static expectations. We'll explain some of these terms. Some people analyze macroeconomic thinking in the context of political economic events, that is in the context of the theories by Karl Marx, the class struggles between the labor class and the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class. And so there are a number of ways in which the same issues or the same concepts can be explained. So I will just be giving you my particular take on economics, but I hope that you will find it useful. Now, if I were to define macroeconomics to you in a line, it would be the study of the economy as a whole. The study of the economy as a whole, as one entity. Earlier, when we talked about economics, we were talking about individual markets, individual products, individual agents, individual firms. But this will change in macroeconomics. We don't look at individual markets, individual agents. We look at the economy as a whole. A very good example of this is that when you are looking at a race, an athletic race, through a set of binoculars, when you look at it through a set of binoculars, you can focus on any individual athlete and how he is moving, whether he is stretching his arms a lot, whether he is struggling, whether he is relaxed, whether he is getting out of breath or whatever. So you can focus on each individual athlete or one particular athlete very well because you are looking at the race. You are sitting in the stadium, but you have a set of binoculars. So you can zoom in on any one athlete. So that would be analogous to how microeconomics is approached. That is, you focus on any individual market within the economy and you look at it from all angles. What would happen if we changed this? What would happen if we changed this? But you leave the rest of the economy untouched. You are not concerned with what is happening in the rest of the economy. So this was the ceteris paribus assumption, that holding everything constant, everything else constant, you are focusing on how events happen or how economics plays out within any individual market. Now, the example of macroeconomic study or macroeconomic thinking would be that when you look at the race, the athletes running a race with your naked eye. So you're sitting in a stadium and you're looking at 15 to 20 people running a 1500 or 2000 meter, 3000 meter race, and you can see them as the whole group. And when you do that, then you will notice different things. You might not be able to see how each particular athlete is doing, but you will notice whether the group of athletes is bunched together, whether they are running close to each other, or whether they are large distances between them. And you're also most likely to spot the winner, right? Because you're getting a bird's eye view of the race. So this is broadly how macroeconomics is differentiated or different from microeconomics. If I were to put it formally, this is how I would put it. That is, macroeconomics involves the aggregation of agents and concepts. Now, when I say aggregation, it means bringing together, adding up of, looking at it in an aggregated form. What are the agents in economics? Who are the agents in economics? You know them very well. In microeconomics, we identified the individual consumer and we looked at how he made his consumption decisions. We looked at the individual firm and how it made its profit maximizing decisions, depending on whether it was operating in a perfectly competitive industry or a monopoly or an oligopoly, etc., etc. We looked at each individual laborer and saw how he made his supply and demand decisions about how much hours of work to supply to the market. But we were only talking about individual agents. It was individual firm, individual consumer, individual owner of factory, that is individual laborer, right? We were also talking about markets, but when we talked about demand and supply in a whole market with 1,000 producers in it or 1,000 consumers in it, fine, there were more agents at play. But note that we still talked about a single product, that is the market for a single good. So we talked about the market for grain, we talked about table tennis, we talked about the chemicals industry. We were still talking about individual products or goods. We were not talking about the whole of the economy or all the sectors combined. We were not addressing issues like what would be the impact of a change in equilibrium in the grain market to the equilibrium in the rice market or to the equilibrium in the steel market, right? So those were the questions that we did not address in microeconomics. Now in macroeconomics, we aggregate the individual agents into their aggregate sectors. That is, we are not interested in the individual consumer. We are now interested in the consumer sector, the consuming sector, that is the household sector in general. So we are not interested in whether a person spends this much amount on medicines and this much amount on food. We are not even interested in whether what the total household spending is. We are now interested in the overall spending or overall consumption spending of the household sector. So we look at the consumption of the household sector in an overall or aggregate sense. Similarly, we are not interested in the individual firm and how it tries to maximize profits, but we are more interested in the investment decisions or the number of laborers hired by firms in aggregate, and we call that the business sector or the manufacturing sector or the industry per se. Similarly, we are not interested in an individual laborer's decision to supply labor and how much labor he supplies, or an individual firm's demand for laborers. But we are more interested in the overall labor market. What are the employment conditions in the labor market? We are not interested in individual markets like steel or grain or rice. We might be interested in those depending on the income distribution or the distribution of the economy. If it's an agrarian economy, we might be interested in what the unemployment rate is in the agricultural sector, because most of our labor force is employed there. But keeping those issues aside, we are more interested in the overall labor force and what are the demand and supply conditions prevailing therein. This is the aggregation of agents. The aggregation of concepts also happens in macroeconomics. So we take the individual level concepts of price and quantity and aggregate them to national level concepts or the economy-wide concepts. Let me give you a couple of examples. Prices. We looked at the prices of individual goods, like the price of table tennis balls, the price of grain, the price of many other commodities. But those were individual commodities. When we are talking about an economy, we are more interested in the overall price level. What is the overall price level? The overall price level is a weighted average index of all the prices of all the goods in the economy. So we look at all these different prices of table tennis balls, of food, of medicines, of cinema tickets, of transport tickets. We put them together, we weight them according to their importance to consumers in general, and then we develop a price index, a national or overall price index. And then we refer to that as the price level when we look at changes in that price level, and that is called inflation. Similarly, on the production side, we were interested earlier in the quantity of a particular product that was produced, right? That the quantity of grain, so many tons of grain, or the quantity of table tennis balls, so many table tennis balls would be produced, etc., etc. Now we're not interested in the quantity produced of any individual good. In fact, we are more interested in the overall domestic production or national output, and we call that gross domestic product. Product basically here stands for production. So we combine all the output that is produced in the economy. Again, we weight them according to their prices, and then we develop the idea of gross domestic product. So we've aggregated both agents and we've aggregated concepts. Let me also talk about demand and supply here. That when we talk about demand and supply in macroeconomics, we're not referring to demand or supply in any individual market. Again, we are talking about the overall demand in the economy. And what is the overall demand in the economy, or what is called aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is simply a summation of all the individual demands in the different individual markets. So it's all the consumers aggregated together and all the markets aggregated together, and then you aggregate the demand of all consumers for all the different products that they demand, and then you sum it all together to get some kind of aggregate demand concept. That's not exactly how it happens, but this is just to explain to you what we mean by aggregate demand in macroeconomics. Similarly, aggregate supply is linked closely to the concept of gross domestic product. How much output is being produced overall? So it might involve certain units of steel, some units of rice, some table tennis balls, some units of medicine, etc., etc. You just combine them all together to get a measure of aggregate supply. So that was broadly what aggregation of agents and aggregation of concepts applies or means in macroeconomics. Now, certainly an important question that you might ask here is that if the aggregate price level or the retail price index or whatever we are talking about, or the aggregate or gross domestic product, if these concepts are merely aggregations of individual outputs and individual prices, then it does not really warrant the introduction of a new field of study in economics. That is, why do we need macroeconomics per se if the only importance of concepts of aggregate demand and the overall price level is that they are simply aggregations or summations of the individual price levels? So we need to establish the individual life of these aggregate concepts. That is, we need to show that these aggregate concepts of the total of the retail price index or of the gross domestic product, they have a life of their own, which rises above or beyond the mere aggregation of the underlying micro markets. That is, it's not only the aggregation of those individual markets which establishes the need for studying these aggregate figures, but that these aggregate figures are important in themselves and they have an impact in turn on these individual micro markets. So this is where the point of difference came between classical economists and modern macroeconomists. The question that was asked essentially was that is the macroeconomy anything more than just a summation of the microcosm, that is, a summation of the individual micro markets, which we have already studied so well and so much in detail in our microeconomics lecture? Or do these macroeconomic variables like overall consumer spending, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, the price index, etc., the GDP, do these have some relationships between them and some impact or implications on government policy that make them important objects of study in their own right? This was the question that was asked earlier on in this century, and the answer that was given was obviously that yes, these variables do have a life of their own. Now, the fact that this debate happened in the early 20th century, that is in the 1930s, means that before 1930s there was no formal concept of macroeconomics as a subject or module of study within economics. And this is actually the truth. Macroeconomics was not taught as a subject or as a field of economics in colleges or schools or in universities until the 1940s. So something must have happened in the 1920s or 30s to necessitate this change that happened in the 1940s. What happened is what we will discuss shortly. There were a number of events that happened in the 1920s and 30s which changed economists or traditional economists' views about whether macroeconomics was necessary or not necessary as an independent branch of economics. So let me introduce to you here the previous or the situation that existed before the 1940s. That is the classical economics that existed, or the pure economics that some people call it, that existed before the 1930s, the 1940s. What was the view of macroeconomics before the 1940s? Well, before that, the view was, and we had some major names in there, leading economists like Alfred Marshall, there was Say, there was Adam Smith, and these people all believed that the macroeconomy or the overall economy was nothing but an aggregation of the individual markets. And they were all firm believers in the power of the markets. Adam Smith gave the notion of the invisible hand of the market, that the invisible hand of the market operates, and therefore the market is the market mechanism or the market model is the best model that an economy can have if it wants to operate at a high level of efficiency. Now, the reason that these classical economists believed that the market would produce an efficient outcome for the economy was simple. We've discussed it in our microeconomics classes as well. When you have a situation of perfect competition, then the market operates, the market mechanism automatically produces the social optimum. And because all of these classical economists believed in a perfectly competitive economy, that is perfectly competitive markets, they believed that the social optimum would obtain at all times. So in other words, shortages and surpluses in different markets. Remember, shortage was a situation where the supply of something fell short of the demand for something. And surplus was when the supply of something exceeded the demand for something. And these classical economists said that shortages and surpluses were temporary phenomena when you had the markets deciding what price and what quantities should obtain in the economy. So if you left it to the market process, the market would decide and the market would clear these shortages and surpluses through the price mechanism. So they gave a lot of importance to the market mechanism, which Adam Smith called the invisible hand. And they believed that the market players, the players in the market, the buyers and sellers, were the people who had the best information about the market. And therefore, there was no business for any outsider. And here, when they talked about outsiders, they included the government in there. That there was no business of any outsider to intervene in the market or try to regulate it in any way. Let the market do its job because it knows how to do its job best, and it usually does that job. Now, there are many ways to articulate the classical economist's view of the economy, of the macroeconomy. And I'm just going to give you a couple of ways of how one can view it. There was the famous Say's law, S-A-Y''S. Say was the name of the economist, and he gave a law that supply creates its own demand. What was this law about? What was this law saying? Essentially what he was saying is that when there was a surplus in the economy, that surplus could not stay forever. That is, when the supply of any good or the supply of labor, let's say, in the economy exceeded the demand for labor, that situation could not persist. Why? Because the excess supply of labor would push the price of labor down, that is, would push the wage rate down, and when the wage rate goes down, firms would increase their employment of labor. So as the wage rate declined, firms' demand for labor would increase, and therefore, in this particular situation, supply has created its own demand. And he extended this principle to all markets in the economy. He said that in any market, when there is excess supply, there is no need to worry. That excess supply will be a transient phenomenon, a temporary phenomenon. It will disappear as prices will be bid down, and then consumer demand or the users of the factors demand will increase, and therefore demand will increase to sweep the excess supply in the market. That was one way of looking at this. Now, another way of saying the same thing was that resources could not be idle in the economy. That is, the classical economists believed that the economy was at its full employment level at all times. So if you think that there was only one factor of production in the economy, let's say only labor, then they said that labor would be fully employed at all points in time. There might be temporary phases of fluctuations where it might be possible that a few laborers are not employed, but this would be very temporary. And the reason was the same as the one that I gave earlier, that supply creates its own demand. So whenever there is an excess supply of labor relative to demand, that is, more people are willing to work than the firms want to employ, that is, there is unemployment in the economy, then as soon as there is unemployment, that will put downward pressure on the wage rate, and this will increase firms' demand for labor, and therefore those excess unemployed laborers would be employed. And therefore the economy could not deviate or could not deviate from its long run full employment level. So this was a major implication or a central belief of the classical system. They believed that the system was self-equilibrating. That is, it was self-equilibrating at the full employment level. The economy in the long run would be at its full employment level. And when they said full employment, it automatically meant that there would be no unemployment of labor. There would be no unemployment of other factors also. No unemployment or underemployment of capital. No unemployment or underemployment of land. Similarly, but most importantly, no unemployment of labor. Now, this overwhelming belief or very powerful belief in the market led the classical economists to two predictions or two implications for policy. The first one was that they predicted that the economy would be stable over time. It would be stable around the full employment level. It could be buffeted around by technology shocks or by imperfections operating in individual markets. But in the long run, it would be stable around the full employment level. The other implication of their belief in the market was that they said that the government should keep its hands out of the market. Let the market supply all the goods and services. The government should keep its intervention at a minimum. And the example that they continued to refer to in this context was that the government should not give benefit payments to unemployed laborers. Now, benefit payments to unemployed laborers is something that is very common in advanced or higher income countries, probably not so common in lower income countries where the government does not have many resources. But in higher income countries, whenever a person becomes unemployed, he gets a benefit payment. The state provides some sort of a cushion to him in order to help him survive through the time that he does not have a job. Now, classical economists believe that when workers had benefit payments, it reduced their incentive to offer themselves for work. And when this happened, you had voluntary unemployment. That is, people who wanted to remain unemployed because they were getting benefit payments while sitting at home doing nothing. They said that the government should withdraw these benefit payments, let those workers offer themselves on the market. This will cause an excess supply of labor, a temporary excess supply of labor in the labor market. This would cause the wage rate to fall, and as the wage rate fell, the demand for labor would increase, and all these excess unemployed, voluntarily unemployed laborers would be employed. So these were the two major implications of predictions or suggestions of the new classical economists. That is, the government should keep its hands out of the market, let the market produce for everything, let the market mechanism operate, and two, it should remove all the impediments to the market system. And impediments were, one example was benefit payments, other examples were taxes, etc., or subsidies, that subsidies on individual food items, etc., etc. Similarly, they said that the economy would be stable around the full employment level. Now, these were very powerful beliefs, as strong as the belief in Bible that many Christians would have. So people really believed in these axioms. This, however, came to an end in the 1920s and 30s. The failure of the classical model was prompted by a series of economic and political events to which the classical economists or classical economics as a school of economics did not or could not provide an answer to. So the solutions that the classical economists presented were not found as reasonable or appropriate or successful in the face of the economic crises that the world faced, or certain countries in the world faced in the 1920s and 30s. Let's begin a study or attempt a little study of what these events were and how the classical economists failed to address the particular concerns that these events raised. Now, the first of these events was the Russian Revolution in 1916, and this was a huge psychological blow to the new classical economists, or the people who believed in the power of the market. The Russian Revolution was inspired by writings of Karl Marx, a German philosopher, and you can also call him an economist, you can call him a number of things. But he introduced this concept of the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, where the proletariat was the working class and the bourgeoisie was the capitalist class. And he said that the capitalist class was exploiting the labor class or the proletariats through this market mechanism and this capitalist system of the economy. And so the Russian Revolution was partly inspired by his writings and the alternative economic system that the Soviet Union gave and adopted after the Russian Revolution, that was of the command economy or the planned economy, posed a threat to the market economics or the free market economics that the classical school believed in or put forward as the ideal school of economics. So this was the first event which sort of shook the foundations of classical economists psychologically. The second major event was hyperinflation in Germany. After the end of the World War I, when Germany lost the war to the Allied forces, the German economy went into a state of hyperinflation. Now, hyperinflation is a state where prices rise very, very fast. That is the inflation rate. That is the rate of change in prices. That is, if the price index was 100 yesterday, it would be 2000 the next year. So the rate of increase in prices would be many hundreds of percents. Usually we are used to 5% or 6% rate of inflation, or 10%. But when hyperinflation occurs, the prices of things change on a daily basis. So if a loaf of bread costs 10 rupees today, it might cost 300 rupees tomorrow, and it might cost 3,000 rupees the day after. So Germany experienced a period of hyperinflation where the prices of goods rose at a tremendously fast rate, and this had two major effects. It eroded the value of savings that people had deposited in the banks. So people had deposited their lifelong savings in banks as deposits or their investments. And these investments or these savings lost their value because of this hyperinflation. Because when they got their money out of the banks, that cash was worth nothing because the prices of goods had risen so much. So if earlier they could purchase, let's say, 5 loaves of bread from 100 Deutschmarks, after this hyperinflation episode, that 100 Deutschmarks that they had deposited in the bank could only fetch them 1 slice of bread. So the purchasing power impact of this was huge. Also, firms had insured their plants and machinery with banks, and they had covered their risks with banks, and the insurance coverage that they had obtained also lost its value. So investment suffered, consumer spending suffered as a result of hyperinflation in Germany. And classical economists could not explain this particular circumstance in which prices continued to rise at such a fast pace. That was the second important event. The third important event was the crash of the New York Stock Exchange in the late 1920s. It's called the tumbling of the Wall Street, or the Wall Street crash. Wall Street means for the United States what the I.I. Chandigarh Road means for Pakistan. That is, it's the economic or financial lifeline of Pakistan. It's in Karachi, and all the headquarters of banks and stock exchanges and key markets, State Bank, etc., are located on the I.I. Chandigarh Road. And the same holds true for Wall Street in New York. The stock exchange and all the major financial organizations have their headquarters on Wall Street. So the Wall Street crash in the late 1920s sent consumer confidence tumbling. People had invested in stocks, in various stocks, and when the stock market crashed, like literally crashed, lost a lot of its value in a few days' time, then consumer confidence also sunk to rock bottom. People then reduced their spending on goods. Firms whose shares had plummeted suddenly found that their book values or their market values had gone down tremendously, and therefore this had a huge impact on investment and consumer spending in the United States. And because the United States was such a large economy, this had effects on Western Europe as well, which had trade links with the United States. So the recession or the depression that happened in the United States found or caused the similar effects to happen in Western Europe, in the United Kingdom, France, and other countries as well. So you have the Soviet Union being formed, which adopted the command economy. You have hyperinflation, a state of very high rate of price increase in Germany in the 1920s. Then you have the stock market crash in New York, which introduces or ushers in a period of Great Depression in the US and Western Europe. The combined effect of all of these was to send the unemployment rates in these economies very high. So the unemployment rate went up to 25% in 1933 in the US and Western Europe, and this was very high. This meant that 25% of the workforce, 25% of the people who were eligible or who wanted to work or offer themselves for jobs could not find jobs. And the reason was that firms were simply not hiring people. Firms' demand for new laborers, for new projects, for new investments was very low. So this was the background in which the modern understanding of macroeconomics, or the school of macroeconomics, was born out of. But let's first try to assess why the classical economists failed to answer the particular concerns that were caused by these 3 or 4 events. Now, the main reason that the classical economists failed to answer the problems that the North American and Western European countries were facing, that is of rising poverty, very high unemployment, low business or firms' confidence, no investment, etc., etc. The reason that the classical economists could not provide an answer was that they kept insisting on the old doctrines, that they kept insisting that let the market work, remove the impediments to the working of the market. So in a way, it was the same kind of answer that some people give when democracy is not working in a particular country, and they say that the answer to this problem is that you give that country more democracy. So only more democracy is the answer to bad democracy. I'm not challenging that, but I'm just telling you that this is the kind of arguments that they gave at the time of the Great Depression, that when policymakers went to these economists and asked them for advice on how they could solve the problem of unemployment, rising poverty, etc., the classical economists retorted by saying, remove the impediments to the functioning of the free market. What were the impediments? The impediments were benefit payments to unemployed workers. So there was already unemployment in the economy, and the economists were asking the governments to remove the little cushion that the governments were providing to those who were unemployed. And obviously this was a very politically a very difficult decision to take, because already people were suffering, already people did not have money to buy, and therefore if you took away the little bit that the government was giving them, then that would anger them further and could create political instability. That was one reason. Now the other reason was that classical economists did not have a theory for explaining sustained periods of unemployment, that is, sustained periods of deviation from the full employment level of output. They could explain why there could be unemployment for a short while, for let's say 6 months or a year, but they could not explain how unemployment could last for 10 years or 7 years or 8 years. They could not explain that. So they simply kept stressing on the need for governments to free up the markets a little bit more. That is, give a freer hand to markets and to remove any intervention that was already happening, any government intervention. And the governments became quite worried about this, because the only interventions that they were sort of doing at that time was providing benefit payments to the people who were unemployed. And when you talk about taking out the benefit payments, then you're thinking about making the people even more angry and even more desperate, and that could have had political implications for these governments in North America and Western Europe. And so the original ideas or the suggestions, the policy advice of classical economists was not received very favorably by the governments of North America and Western Europe, at least after the Great Depression had lasted for about 7-8 years, from 1927 to about 1934-35. At this point in time, however, came along a gentleman by the name of John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes gave a general theory of employment in which he said the exact opposite things of what the classical economists said. So instead of saying that supply created its own demand, Keynes said that demand created its own supply. That is, it was the demand conditions, the aggregate demand conditions in the economy, which determined what the supply level of the economy would be, or what employment level the economy would settle at. Also, he said that the macroeconomy was more than just a summation or an aggregation of the individual markets. There was more to macroeconomics than just that, and that even if the individual markets were functioning properly and were being governed by the market mechanism perfectly, there could be something happening at the aggregate level which needed to be addressed. Something like business confidence, something like expectations, and we'll talk a little bit more about these. So he basically introduced the need to study macroeconomics as a separate subject or separate sub-subject within economics. That is, he said that there was more to the macroeconomy than simply an aggregation of the individual markets. Now, there were two main aspects to Keynes's theory. The first one was where he tried to explain the Great Depression, how you could have a situation of very low business confidence year after year after year, or how you could have periods or episodes of sustained unemployment and poverty, etc., and low consumer spending. And secondly, he gave the policy advice, very solid policy advice, on how governments could rectify the situation or change the situation of sustained unemployment. So this was a very powerful theory indeed. Now, Keynes's idea of how or why a period of sustained unemployment could come about was located in his understanding of expectations and how people formed expectations about the future. Keynes paid a lot of attention to uncertainty. He said that when the economic environment was uncertain, that is, when people did not know what lay ahead for them in the future, it was very rational for them to expect the future to be exactly the same as what it is today, right? So it was rational for them to expect the situation prevailing today to continue into tomorrow. So if you had a situation of unemployment today or very low business confidence today, consumers or agents or firms were likely to continue with those expectations in the future. And until you found a way to break those expectations, right, to change those expectations, or introduce a shock which would change the economic environment suddenly, then the whole of the economy would be locked in a continuous wave of unemployment or low business confidence, etc., etc. So that was one side or one explanation that Keynes gave for the continuation of sustained unemployment in the market. The second explanation that he gave was that it is not possible for labor markets to be as flexible as classical economists had expected them to be. So he said that when there is excess unemployment in the market, then the wages can go down, but they can only go down to a particular level. They can't go down below subsistence level. And therefore, at some point, wages become sticky. And therefore, firms' demand for labor cannot increase to the extent that classical economists had predicted them to increase. But more importantly, Keynes said that firms' demand for labor and firms' demand for new projects was not just a function of the wage rate, the price at which laborers offered their services. It was a function of their expectations about the future of the economy. If firms felt that the goods that they would produce would not be bought by anybody, if they felt that the economic conditions would worsen in the future or would continue to deteriorate in the future, and when they had this expectation, they were mainly referring to what the purchasing power of households would be. So generally, if there is unemployment in an economy, the purchasing power of households would be very low. So firms looked at these things, and then they said that there is no point in producing more goods because the households are getting poorer by the day and they will not be able to buy the goods that we will produce. So there is no point in expanding output. And once firms make this decision, then they don't hire more labor even when the wage rate is falling and falling and falling. So those were the kinds of explanations, very powerful logical explanations that Keynes gave for the sustained unemployment episode that was witnessed in North America and Western Europe in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Now, what was the policy advice that Keynes gave to help address such a problem? Mainly, Keynes said that demand creates its own supply. So he said that the full employment level of the economy would only obtain if there was enough demand in the economy to absorb the supply of factors, or the supply of resources. If there was not enough demand in the economy, and he divided demand into 3 different types, which we will talk in detail about in our next lecture. He divided demand into investment demand, consumption demand, government spending demand, that is the demand for goods and services by the government, and then the demand which comes in the form of net exports, that is foreign demand for domestic goods. So he introduced demand as the key engine of the employment or the level of activity of an economy. And he said that it's very important for governments to affect demand conditions if they want to change the state or the equilibrium state of an economy. So supply was relatively elastic in the economy. It was demand which had to be changed in order to take the economy from one equilibrium to the other. So we will talk about the exact nature of the demand and supply curves also in our next lectures, and what the particular assumptions of the classical economists were about how the demand curve and the supply curves were shaped. We will talk about these, but right now I'm just giving you the feel of what Keynes's arguments were. So one was that governments need to affect demand. How do they do that? Governments can affect demand by boosting either consumer confidence, which was difficult to do because consumers were not really bullish about the prospects of the economy. The government could not convince firms to make more investments or to generate investment demand or demand for new projects, because the firms were bearish about the prospects of the economy as well. So it was the government itself, according to Keynes, which had to generate that excess demand that would employ the excess resources in the economy. So the government had to build new roads. The government had to start new projects. The government had to generate new activities for the employment of these excess laborers who could not find jobs. Note that in making these suggestions, Keynes was assuming 2 important things, or at least he himself believed in 2 important things. One was that he did not believe that the people who were unemployed because they chose to remain unemployed. That is, just because they were getting benefit payments. He believed that the people who were unemployed involuntarily. That is, that they wanted to work. They wanted to be productive members of society, but there was no demand for them. There was no demand for their skills or for their services. That was one. The other point that Keynes believed in or made was that the economy could settle at a point where the employment of resources was not full. That is, if you think of the production possibilities frontier, it was possible for the economy to settle at an equilibrium inside the production possibilities frontier, not on the production possibilities frontier. This, according to classical economists, was not a possibility. They believed that you could only have a long-run equilibrium along the production possibilities frontier. That is the point at which all resources were fully employed. So Keynes believed that demand created its own supply. He believed that involuntary unemployment could exist, and he believed that the economy could settle at an equilibrium with less than full employment. Now that's all that I want to talk about today. I have not yet completed the discussion on Keynesian economics. I mean, Keynes, the changes that he introduced were not everlasting. Some of the policies that he suggested, some of the ideas that he suggested were not taken on board by economists further down the decades. So tomorrow or in the next lecture, we look at the question of the limitations of Keynesian policies, the demand management focus that Keynes gave us, and whether that was warranted or that was optimal for all circumstances of an economy, or whether that applied or that was suitable for only particular circumstances of the economy like the Great Depression. After that, we will discuss where do we stand today in terms of where macroeconomic thinking is today. I mean, Keynes's time was over in the 1940s. A number of developments have happened in economics since that time, in macroeconomics since that time, and we will discuss them briefly. The main thrust of the course will remain on this distinction between classical and Keynesian economics, but it's important for you to know that that things have moved on since then, and there have been some new changes that have been introduced since then. Now, introducing macroeconomics to any class is never easy. It's not an easy task. I remember the teacher who taught us macroeconomics faced the same problems. Sometimes the things he was teaching us did not make sense to us. Sometimes he was talking about history, sometimes about concepts. When we understood the history, we did not get the concepts. When we got the concepts, we did not know the historical background. So you might experience the same problems to start with. But hopefully in the next 2 to 3 lectures, you will develop a good feel for where the history was and where the concepts are. So keep going, keep your spirits up, and I assure you that you will grasp or get a good understanding in the end. So my friends, till our next lecture, it will have to be Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.